Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this Acates Live session on Thursday, the 13th of June. Today, we're going to be talking about developing and delivering a fundraising strategy. My name's Deborah Larwood, and I am Director of Income Generation at Acates. We're a cultural consultancy company supporting commercial and contributed income generation, impact management, evaluation, business planning and strategy at both an organisational and policy level, leadership development, change management and recruitment. Our monthly webinar series of Acates Live takes a deep dive into key topics and areas of focus or challenge in both contributed and earned income generation. And whilst we, of course, acknowledge that Acates doesn't necessarily have all of the answers, what we think we do have is an overview of the sector itself. And we're really passionate about using this perspective and role in a supportive way. Finally, just to say that, as always, all of the information shared in today's conversation is, of course, live and correct at the time of broadcast. Now, I'm really delighted to be able to welcome our special guests this afternoon, who will be exploring the topic of developing and delivering a fundraising strategy here with me today. First up is Chantelle Bell, Head of Development at Tallowa Theatre Company.
Hello.
Hello, Chantelle. Chantelle is a preservationist of African diaspora culture and history, who's worked as an arts management consultant, artist, and cultural entrepreneur. A trained anthropologist, Chantelle published the first guide to the archival holdings of Caribbean Americans in New York, and also studied, performed, and taught folkloric West African dance throughout New York City. As a management consultant, she's fundraised and managed programs for an array of cultural organisations, including the Caribbean Cultural Centre, 651 Arts, Camille A. Brown and Dancers, and the Evidence Dance Company. She's produced cultural festivals, panel discussions, symposia and fundraising events. And in the giving world, Chantelle has served on a number of grant panels and chaired the Mission and Benevolence Fund at Emmanuel Baptist Church. Hello, Chantelle. Lovely to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me.
And second of all on our panel today is Helen Gaffney, one of our senior consultants here at Acates. Helen works with arts and cultural organisations across the UK to build income, develop audiences and strengthen governance. Helen actually works across both our income generation and strategy divisions, focusing on the delivery of major strategic research, audience group logic modelling, community consultation and impact evaluation, as well as fundraising strategy, development and implementation, prospect pipeline development and coaching and mentoring. She's recently worked with Bath Spa University, supporting the establishment of both the National Centre for Fashion and Sustainability and the new Centre for Humankinds. Helen's work has also seen her act as interim head of development for organisations such as Brixton House, as well as supporting clients including the People's Orchestra, Grand Union and Tramshed on the development of major strategic fundraising activities. Prior to Acates, Helen led Arnolfini's voluntary and commercial income, successfully reshaping the case for the gallery's economic, social and cultural value and establishing an income model following the relaunch of the gallery in partnership with the University of the West of England in 2019. Hello, Helen.
Hi, good morning. It's really good to be here.
Now, on to today's topic. My personal experience of fundraising strategies when working in-house in cultural organisations over my career has been incredibly varied. From arriving into a team where things were operating well and successfully, but the fundraising strategy was rarely revisited and certainly wasn't regarded as a live document, to other roles where writing the strategy has been pretty much one of the first priorities in the job, and that's brought with it interesting opportunities to set the frame. Historically, and I'd suggest unfortunately, a fundraising strategy has somewhat been regarded as simply the target which has been perhaps arbitrarily set for a department to achieve, and even worse, essentially represented the gap between income and expenditure, as opposed to being a target which has been set and which is owned by fundraisers with the support of senior managers. Whilst the gap in income and expenditure is something which you would want to be aware of course, it's increasingly clear that this tension is an organisational issue and not something which can be addressed or solved in isolation within one department. A good fundraising strategy is a shared roadmap for the organisation and something which outlines what can be realistically achieved in voluntary income generation terms. It should detail how it will be achieved, what assets and resources will be needed to realise the ambitions, as well as any other issues and implications. And whilst there is, of course, best practice, there isn't really a one-size-fits-all approach to writing a fundraising strategy, not least because your strategy should be fully aligned with your organisation's purpose, but also the organisation's assets and the landscape within which you're working, be that geographic, demographic, financial. It'll be all subject to nuance, and therefore the opportunities and the best approach to fundraising will look very different for different organisations. At Akaties, we've delivered our best-selling workshop, Building a Fundraising Culture and Making the Ask, to well over 100 organisations. And those sessions are often with senior teams and trustees. And what I find really fascinating and valuable about those sessions is to be facilitating detailed and meaningful conversations about how to approach fundraising, that importance of shared understanding of the landscape within which the organisation is operating, what they're fundraising for, what they regard their assets to be, and what they want the community of supporters around the organisation to look like. And importantly, how they're going to go about building those relationships. And these are, of course, some of the very foundations of a fundraising strategy. When I was head of development at Opera North, I was always really delighted to be part of the induction for new starters across the company and would happily sit with people and talk through the headlines of fundraising at the company, why we did it, what it looked like, what our headline aims were. And I'm sure lots of people forgot much of that detail after that meeting, but I always maintained that it was an important part of that initial orientation process, and that only by sharing insights into what the fundraising strategy looks like can we then create the best environment for others to help drive change and ultimately raise contributed income. Needless to say, there's a lot to unpack in today's topic, and many of you watching will very likely be at quite different points in your fundraising strategy development and delivery. But as I alluded to earlier, a fundraising strategy is a roadmap. It's a living plan, which should be your North Star. Even when you've got one in place, things are changing around us all the time. And in order for that strategy to remain valuable, it will sometimes need to change with that. So it's at this point that I'd love to draw our two panelists into today's conversation. So I'd like to start by inviting each of them in turn to tell us about their work in this area, how they've developed strategies and identified and worked with key internal stakeholders to develop actionable and live planning tools. Chantal, I wonder if I could come to you first, please.
Sure. So my experience with strategy development is varied. For a lot of my career, I've been positioned externally to a handful of small organizations and kind of able to come in and help them to think more broadly about their fundraising as a unit, as a year, as a set of goals, as something that there are this family of stakeholders who are involved in. But you kind of find that, you do the work, you SWOT everyone, you do the market research, you put together this beautiful thing, you design it, you drop in your infographics and it's like, oh, look at this beautiful plan. And they're like, thank you. And they put it on the shelf and go on with their lives. And they're like, where's the money? I think that the ideal case, where there are all of these elements involved and all of these people and this research that's able to come together is often just not the reality on the ground for organizations. Those that have the resources to be able to bring in the support to do it, they often don't on the back end have the experience with working from a plan, with having this plan be in front of them. And it's like, how do we integrate this and reference this and, try things and debrief and keep pushing and keep going, I think that Taloa is in an interesting case, one, me being inside the organization as head of development, and, just Taloa in general being in this growth spurt at the moment. When I came in, we had just gotten an uplift from the Arts Council. Definitely, since I've been there with the support of the Acades team, we've been able to win. Well, the organization has had these ongoing relationships with some good trust and foundations, who fund culture in a really good way. And we've been able to leverage some really strong pots of support. We were also part of the London Borough of Culture, and we're able to kind of leverage these new statutory funding opportunities. And it really doubled the operating budget. So, the shift from about 600K to about 1.2 million in a short space of time. It's an exciting moment for the organization, but then on the back end, there are all of these things in terms of capacity, in terms of the new responsibilities that come on board, the evaluation load and how that's doubled, and all of these things that, that are intertwined and impact our fundraising strategy. We are one of those who had a beautiful fundraising strategy developed by Acades that was sitting on a shelf that I kind of blew the dust off, and it was like, wow, this is really good. How do we integrate some of this stuff now? And also that finally there actually is development staff, and how do we now do an internal take on our fundraising strategy? It's fascinating because, there is the understanding and the will to do it from our executive level and also from the governance level, so that there is, those kind of two checkpoints in terms of the support for the planning. But I will say the department would need to grow, the considerations around capacity. And it's like, yeah, I would love to, do an away day. I would love to gather the trustees and some stakeholders. I would love to, get perspectives from I would love to do some market research and look at our colleagues and see where they are and how they configure it. But it's kind of like, oh, I have that report to do. Up, here's this donor event. Up, we have to do this. Up, here's this deadline, and I think managing the balance between, pushing strategy forward, but also managing just the day-to-day activities of, of a busy department is really top of mind for me, I think, with Taloa's fundraising strategy. And I can share with you what we've done in our case, because as you say, it's kind of, I think it's art and science, and you have your cards that you're dealt and you figure out your way through it. So Taloa's way through it, is it kind of starts with our executive director. She has a set of ideas, she has some things that she wants done. She's setting the top line budgetary targets for the department. And she's kind of like, here are all of my notes, have at it. So I've had the pleasure of being able to pull forward that original fundraising plan that we had that was prepared by Acades. So at least there's some continuity between the last one and the next one, and that we're able to kind of pick up some of the really great ideas and great instructions and research that were in that one, but then also to integrate the ED's new ideas, but also my understanding of where the organization is and what is possible at this moment. I was able to push for a development committee on amongst the board and trustees. And we have a couple of really committed trustees who want Tallowa to succeed and want this to succeed, so that there's this other kind of level of accountability. There's this other set of eyes on the strategy. There are these great interactions that we're having with, people who are high level professionals in the field and able to give this wonderful, perspective on what we plan to do. Ideally for me, that relationship with the trustees will translate into kind of being a liaison between the strategy and the bits of it that we're hoping that the board will take ownership of, and we are in the process, I think, for the first time, of putting together a document that is developed in-house, that there are all of these hands in it, and that there are all of there's this good support for it. And being kind of a department of one right now is definitely a challenge. But one of the ways that we mitigate that is that we make it clear that fundraising is everyone's responsibility in the organization, so that when I need things from the team, they understand that, okay, I have 300 things, but this fundraising task has to be prioritized. So I have to get Chantel this information, or we have to take some time to support this event, or, Chantel's at my desk again, having a conversation with me about something. Why is she here? But let me stop and listen to her, so it becomes all of this really great energy around pushing the fundraising forward, but I think that being in an environment where everyone really loves the work, everyone is really in love with the mission. I think we feel a good history behind us of, success and accomplishment. We feel heard, and that we feel seen, and that we're in this growth moment that everyone kind of feels like we're riding. I think it is a strategy, developed in a really fertile environment. And now I think it becomes my responsibility to kind of, make sure that seed is firmly planted and then nurture it so that it can grow. And that is to be the work now, I think, is to kind of jump over that line that I mentioned in the beginning, where it's kind of like, we have a strategy, it's so beautiful. Oh, wait, we have to do this task. We have to do this task. And really to understand the difference, I think, between a plan and a strategy, this difference between, here are these things that I have to do, as opposed to here's this place that we need to get to, for this year, for the next 3 years, for the next 5 years. Here are these things that we're trying to put into place to get us from point A to point B, and making sure that we figure out how to take it off of the shelf and make it real after we button up the final document.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chantel. I think I'm sure lots of people watching will be thinking the thoughts similar to mine, which are, what a wonderful account of an organization which so clearly has a deep understanding of fundraising and a fundraising culture embedded throughout. The way that you talk about that collaboration with colleagues is, music to our ears. There are certainly some things I think that you've shared that I'm going to want us to dig into a little bit more as we go through the questions. But just a couple of things that that really sort of were at the front of my mind was that point you so eloquently made about the reality on the ground, and the sort of comprehensive, all-encompassing strategy, and how those two things are sometimes perhaps in conflict, or one dominates over the other, and how we manage that as a team, I think is a really important observation to have made. There's something around the other opportunities that come our way as organisations. So, in Talawa's case, you were talking about Borough of Culture and how that opened up other opportunities in statutory funding, which, may not otherwise have been available to you, and how as an organisation you can respond to that, but also weave that into your strategy moving forwards. And the other point, which I don't think we talk about enough, is evaluation. And when we're thinking about how to grow that contributed income and which trusts and foundations in particular, for example, that we want to try and forge relationships with, how we are planning for that relationship management, where evaluation is so critical. And, I would say in some parts of our sector, probably one of the areas that we find most challenging or is sort of perhaps underdeveloped in some senses. So thank you so much for your generosity. And as I say, I'm excited to come back to some of those points as we move on. Helen, can I come to you next, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in terms of reflecting on some of my experience, I definitely have experience of joining organisations where re-establishing a fundraising strategy has been absolutely the first priority. In 2020, I joined Arnolfini, an arts organisation in Bristol, and what was made very clear to me, even in the interview process, was that as an organisation, we needed to rebuild fundraising from scratch, and that's across every single income strand and through every part of the organisation. I joined Arnolfini at a moment of real step change. We had left Arts Council's NPO, and as a result, a new business and operational model had been established to relaunch the gallery. What we also coincided with was it was 2020 and of course COVID, and obviously the gallery went through many periods of closure in that year and the following year as well. I think in terms of developing a fundraising strategy in this context, what I was able to do with, we had a really small but very brilliant organisational team. I think there was only about 7 of us in the whole organisation because we'd started to rebuild and then COVID, we were really able to collaboratively test and explore areas of fundraising. And I think it was a really interesting opportunity because for us, it was able to direct the way that we were able to understand what areas of income might be the best route for us and begin to shape our understanding of what it might be possible to raise. And I think just in terms of how we did that, as we rebuilt our programme, we were able to start thinking about really small applications to trust funders. And we were able to really explicitly say, we're starting from scratch. We're restarting a medium-term commitment to engage these local groups. Will you help us? And just being really upfront and honest about that. Equally, through a successful Cultural Recovery Fund application, we were able to begin plotting what future statutory investment might look like. And absolutely that ended up resulting in a re-entry into the NPO in 2023. And that really started from that Cultural Investment Fund success and thinking, we're getting traction here, and here's where we might develop that relationship with the Arts Council. Again, through gallery bookings, which was a new thing for us. It's something that Arnolfini hadn't done before. We were able to leverage income through an option to donate. So it was free to visit the gallery. You just had to make a booking, and we were able to put in that donation option. What we were really able to do there was, for the first time, develop an understanding of who was visiting the gallery and how. And through that, we were able to re-engage previous supporters, but also to engage with new supporters as well. And then finally, through Zoom, we were able to think about the development of a new corporate offer. And it was very much a walk around the gallery behind the scenes. Here's an exhibition that we've produced and presented, and it's actually, the doors are closed. And I think for us, that was our foothold for engaging both local and national businesses back with the gallery. I think in many ways, this was a back to front way of developing a fundraising strategy, but actually I really learned a lot from it. And I think the fact that we had more space than usual to understand what worked and to define what our strengths were was really important as we tested those approaches. And my background as a fundraiser is as a prospect researcher. So I love data, I love evidence. And I think the thing that I really was able to do and was really able to galvanize as we sort of worked through this process across the organization, but with our board as well, was to really use that data, particularly from gallery bookings, and say, we don't have a base of supporters who are ready to make a major gift. I think it was one of those classic questions of where are the major gifts coming from? And I think I really had the confidence through the trends we could identify in those booking patterns to say, it's not now, it's not next year, it might be in 5 years, but here's how we get there, or how we might test getting there. And I think that was really important at that time, to kind of take our stakeholders with us. So it was definitely the most live strategy I've worked on. I think very much from being in-house, and sort of very much sort of to draw on Chantal's experiences of working through a strategy as it goes within the busyness of your day to day. But it was also a really interesting way to set income areas that Arnolfini could invest in the future, and sort of identifying where it was best to put kind of its fundraising strengths and investment. I think what I've learned through it, and what I definitely bring through to my Katie's practice, is that a fundraising strategy absolutely needs to be informed by what you know, and that's both internal and external data. And I think in terms of the cultural organisations I'm currently working with, what's really clear is that there's a stronger emphasis than ever on how they want to think about securing core funding. And for me, I think that's a really interesting point, to think how a fundraising strategy can respond to that. I think it's a really interesting challenge, and it's one I'm really excited about in the conversations I'm currently having about that, because I think it gives more opportunities than ever for fundraising to be owned across the organisation, as the success on securing core income will be really dependent on bringing that case for investment back to your core purpose. So I think there's some really interesting conversations I'm in as organisations navigate what was their set fundraising strategy, and of course all of the challenges that we're currently experiencing, and how they use that to leverage core. So it's a challenge, but it's one I'm excited about.
Wonderful, thank you. Thanks so much, Helen, for sharing particularly your experiences at Arnolfini, which I think, I'm sure people watching who were, working in the sector during COVID will probably resonate with them, that idea of being given something of an opportunity to do a bit of testing. I'm always interested in organisations' appetite for risk taking, and where failure is allowed, because I think with any sort of fundraising strategy, there are certain assumptions that we can draw, we can use evidence, but there is always an element of let's find out. And I think the more we can give people the confidence and the scope to try and potentially fail, that's where the kind of really rich and exciting developments, I think, sit and potentially lie. There's some really interesting observations that you were making about sort of those kind of that Lego bricks or building blocks approach. So, for example, using that CRF relationship as a route to build statutory funding and ultimately get back into the MPO with Arts Council. And yeah, them using data and analysing data to mine for opportunities. And there's lots of organisations who are in very different positions, I would imagine, with regards to the quality of the data and the amount of data that they hold. And, that can be incredibly challenging depending on where you sit on that spectrum. And I think the point about core funding is so brilliantly made, because I think that project, there is sort of a general agreement that project funding is easier to find. And in a world where actually fundraising as a landscape is incredibly challenging, project funding is certainly challenging as well. But core is often the area I find where clients say, we're stuck, we're struggling, and making that case for core, I think, is increasingly important. And as you say, Helen, rightly so, I think that's an opportunity for cross-organisationally to really strengthen that narrative and those key arguments. You've also touched on some things that I can't wait to come back to in the questions. And my first question that I'd love to explore with you both is, what, in the sort of process of developing a fundraising strategy, at what point do you feel that you would want to, or you should be, involving the board and other key stakeholders? Chantal, can I come to you first and your thoughts on that?
I feel like in an ideal case, we get the feedback from the board early on, that at the moment that we decide that we are working on this strategy, we're updating the strategy, that we identify what the board involvement would be, and we let them know that it's happening. And, they kind of, it helps us to set the deadline on it, because we're delivering it to the board. And ideally, they're involved, in a way that makes them feel a sense of ownership of it, so that this is our plan, these are our decisions, this is what we've decided to do, and that they can stay on top of it. You know, I like the way you said in the beginning, Deborah, that when a new hire comes on board, you make sure that you take the time to kind of go over those top line fundraising ideas with them, even if they don't remember all of the specifics, that the interaction with it keeps it on their mind, you know. So I feel like with trustees, I really want them involved at the beginning. I want them to have specific parts of the plan that are their responsibility, that they kind of take charge of a fundraising event or an appeal somehow, that they fully understand it and that they're able to kind of be a part of it, to work on it, and then that kind of accountability and you know, debriefing or look back role. Those are the ways that ideally the trustees are involved.
Right. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think, you know, especially I guess in you know, the case of Tallow, as you said earlier, Chantal, you know, you're a department of one. You know, it isn't feasible to imagine that, you know, it can't all sit on the shoulders of one person. That's true for any organization. And I think the more we can create clarity around the expectations and how you're going to work with trustees and other stakeholders, the better, I think, for actually mobilizing around those elements or kind of pillars of your strategy. Helen, any thoughts on you on this question?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's really important is whilst you kind of want to have your grounding for what the evidence and the data is saying, I think it's absolutely about giving your board space to feed into it. And I think the best strategy is informed by that circle of here's what the data is showing us, but here's what it actually feels like, and here's what the conversation is telling us. Because I think by starting with that benchmark of here's our baseline, here's what we know, here's the evidence, that helps to inform and spark those conversations with your board in particular, of actually informing the way that they can contribute. So I think getting that little way ahead to use their time as usefully as possible is really key. But I think absolutely ensuring that they're involved reasonably early in the process to capture their thoughts, because again, only so much happens behind a desk. So I think those conversations are really critical. And I think, yeah, ensuring that that's fed in at an early stage is really, really important.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
What about the flip side of this? What about when we involved the trustees and they're like, hey, I think we should really do a bake sale, you know, or hey, I think we should really get an app, you know, that there's this power dynamic that I find is present with trustees. Have you guys ever experienced this? And then how do you deal with it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I aside from the fact that I think a bake sale is a brilliant idea, and through Katie's, when I'm thinking about particularly individual giving with an organisation, and actually I was doing this just yesterday, I feel really passionately that you know, a community way to do a bake sale, or you know, why aren't people running marathons for arts organizations? You know, I think that's a really exciting moment. So I think I don't have the full answer to your question, but I think actually capturing those ways that your board are asking, how can we leverage ways to contribute? So I think it's really an interesting question in terms of how a board is able to give in different ways. And I think absolutely we know that in the UK, we don't replicate that US model of kind of investment on a board, and actually that sort of recognition of a major gift might buy you a place at the table. I think that's a really exciting proposition. And again, Deborah, you might have your own reflections, but I don't have the full answer. But I feel really excited when new ideas like that are brought to the table, particularly around things like bake sales, to be honest.
Yeah, I agree, Helen. I think the other thing I would probably add to that is that because I really recognize that point, Chantal, and I think, you know, the last thing anybody wants is to invite the board members in to engage and, you know, play a part, and then for those board members to feel that their ideas haven't been heard, that they haven't brought value to the table, because that could have a really adverse effect on their sort of engagement and support in fundraising going forwards. So I guess some of the things that I would be thinking about is, who are the trustees? What's that current culture looking like at board level? What's their understanding of fundraising? And quite frankly, the particular nuances of cultural sector fundraising, so that, you know, you hopefully can preempt some of the direction of travel that some of the conversations might go in. I definitely agree with Helen. I think creating that forum to bring all ideas together is really important. And it might be that actually that process brings ideas through that the team hasn't thought of, or, you know, sort of it wasn't on the radar. I think what's really important to ensure, though, is that anyone participating in bringing their ideas and thoughts has access to the understanding of the landscape, because I think that really is, that's what kind of roots, that's the foundations upon which we need to build our strategy, is what's happening in the world. You know, what does cultural giving look like at the moment, so that we're hopefully not then setting ourselves up for, you know, sort of projects and strands of activity wildly at odds with that context. And actually that probably brings us quite neatly onto our next question, which is about those external forces outside of an organization, and in what ways they might shape or influence your approach to developing a fundraising strategy. Chantal, do you want to respond to that one first with us?
About the way that external forces shape our strategy. You know, I think that with TALOA, there are so many internal forces that we're trying to get a handle on. You know, when I think about, you know, my most recent thoughts around external forces have really been, you know, really specific to our case as a Black organization, you know, having gone through this kind of post Black Lives Matter moment where, you know, there was a lot of funding that was being, you know, kind of pushed towards our organizations, which was wonderful. But being able to continue at that pace, you know, that we have this uplift, and definitely part of that reason was that, you know, the Arts Council did this kind of restructuring and rethinking about the way that their funding was distributed, and really, you know, their efforts to be more equitable, to, you know, go into these communities. We're in Croydon, which is one of those places where, you know, it was frankly underfunded, you know, so it's kind of like, I think the external challenge that we have is that, you know, we reaped some benefits from this historic moment, but as it wanes, are we going to return back to the case where, you know, often those doors were closed to us? Or are we going to be able to continue the relationships and to build on the relationships and to be able to kind of benefit from the fact that, you know, hey, we have this healthy set of support, and, you know, how do we now be able to go, you know, look at where we are today and let us push that forward, you know, like that is the major thing that is, you know, that we are facing and dealing with. But it's also a very intangible kind of future facing thing, you know, so it still rides this divide between what do we have to do right now, and, you know, here is this other thing for us to address. And to be honest, I don't know that we will be able to proactively address it, that we have to kind of just keep pushing forward.
Yeah, thank you, Chantal. And it's really, really good point. And I guess with any fundraising strategy, it's about having got to hand, being able to articulate where you're going to focus your resource, where you're going to focus your energy, because you believe that's where the, you know, the returns can be found, but also ensuring that you're porous enough as a team, as an organization, to respond to things that are changing and to respond to opportunities that might come with those changes. Helen, one of the things that you touched on earlier on was about using evidence to inform expectation setting. And I wonder what your thoughts are about balancing ambition with managing expectations, and what advice you might give to ensure that any fundraising strategy is a living document which is doing those things sort of in parallel.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's absolutely around that tangibility of giving you that pushing off point, because I think something like prospect research, and sort of as I've shared that I've started my career as a prospect researcher, and it's really informed my fundraising practice, which is a real evidence base of what are the real tangible goals that we're working towards here. And it really helps structure your critical path and your timeline and your priorities. And I think it's, as we sort of spoke about earlier a little bit, it's those Lego blocks of how do you build your way forward and how do you bring your organization and your board with you. So I think absolutely something like prospect research, it really, I think if you're able to do that in-house or invest in being able to commission a little bit of prospect research to support your strategy, it's a really useful way of rationalizing what you think you might know and what actually exists. And I think being able to set some clear goals and ambitions around what you're working towards with that structure really helps to focus those priorities. And I think, I think that's happened throughout my career in terms of how that can play a role.
Lovely. Thanks, Helen. Chantal, from your point of view, how do you feel about that sort of expectation setting, ambition, sort of keeping those things at play together?
You know, I think that, I think that especially in the individual giving space, that, the ambition, it really, it's clearly to grow it, and to kind of push it forward. I'll share that Talawa right now has a base of donors who are mostly monthly recurring donors who have been, giving to Talawa for almost 5 years, but a lot of them are really small, 5 and 10 pounds a month, and we appreciate it and we love it, but the expectation, is for us to develop this base of donors that's much more stratified, that, we're able to, recruit the major gifts. We're able to kind of course, upgrade the donors that we currently have. And the path towards that, in our case of being such a small department, is really challenging, and we would love to be able to invest in, some prospecting, to do a major donor push. But, the most that I can do is, I've met with the trustees and kind of spoken to them about who would be good targets for us. And the most I've been able to do is kind of try to have coffee with people, try to meet with them and discuss with them. And then on our own side, begin to build this case for support, be able to talk to the execs and the department heads about what are the future facing things that we have that would excite a donor, and to be able to sit and have these conversations with them. I'm now putting together a kind of cultivation event so that they can come in and have these types of interactions with the works that we're putting on, with the cast and the playwrights and things like that, so it's kind of, we are in the space of that where we're building the relationships, but definitely that projection in the budget for that line in individual giving is one that I'm looking at, like, it definitely takes time and effort and, investment to be able to turn those around. And, all we can do is keep putting one foot in front of the other and seeing where it goes.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think, that point about cultivation, it's relationship development. And as you rightly say, relationships take time. I know some of the work that we do with organizations, particularly around things like upcoming capital projects, where organizations are looking for often within their strategy, major donations, and we are often talking to organizations to ensure that they are keenly aware of managing their expectations, because a first gift is so rarely a major gift. It is about building that relationship, establishing a relationship of trust, a relationship of reciprocity, building confidence and building mutual understanding. And it's absolutely possible to get to that point, but it's just not going to happen overnight. Chantal, I'd love just to come back on this point about a fundraising strategy as kind of a toolkit or a living document, because I know you mentioned, of course, that there's been strategies that have sat on the shelf, you've dusted them off, and they're great and relevant, but they've not necessarily been actively used. So what would your advice be for an organization to use it as more of a playbook, a practical tool? What does that look like in practical terms?
For me, I have to build moments into my year. I have to kind of create this external pressure for myself, where I kind of set the times where it was part of the reason that I pushed for the board committee, so that we have this moment where it's like, I have to have this conversation with them about where we are against these benchmarks. Ideally, we're meeting and communicating way more often, but at least there's that moment where it's kind of like the strategy has to become alive because we're taking this time to review it and see where we are. And then short of that, that there are elements of it that should be feeding, the activities as we're going along, or, you kind of are able to say, all right, here's this item that the only way it's going to get pushed forward is if I get some support, is if, if the trustees take this on, or if we, or if we talk to Katie's about doing it, or if we, so it's kind of like, for me, the best way to keep it alive in a space where it's impossible to refer to it on a regular basis is to make sure that I set and cement those times in my calendar year where I'm forced to look at it and reference it and set a plan in place to push things forward.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chantal. Helen, what advice would you give an organization to ensure that it's a live and useful tool?
Yeah, I think just building on what Chantal said there, those moments of reflection and review, that regularly looking at it are so important because it helps you identify where you are, what's not working, and where you might need to adjust or reforecast. I think for most of my fundraising career, I've often been a development team of one and often part-time. So I think in terms of kind of how you instill that across a fundraising team, it's quite often been just me. And I think that actually opens up that opportunity to ensure that fundraising is owned, or it's my responsibility to ensure that fundraising is owned across the organization, because I think it's, I'm not able to kind of carve it off across a development team, but what I am able to do is sort of work with the program team or an engagement team and think about actually which areas of this can we work on together, and sort of ensuring that that's built in across the year as well.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Helen. And also, I would say there were just they sound like really sort of obvious steps to take, but I'm sometimes surprised at sort of when the response is we don't actually know where the strategy is. Your strategy should be saved somewhere where it's accessible by the people whose remit it is to deliver it, but the senior leadership team should be able to find that strategy. A development committee should have access to that strategy so that, if you've built that shared understanding of which direction you're headed in and why and how you're going to get there, you have to ensure that people have got access to that material. I think another really practical step that I would advocate for is taking some of those ambitions and actions from the strategy and weaving them into KPIs. So it's similar to your point, Chantal, and that sort of the milestone setting, but sort of dividing and conquering, I suppose, some of those objectives into KPIs that can then be reviewed and discussed in things like one-to-ones, for example. As I said at the very beginning, I think this is a huge topic of conversation, and there was always going to be a lot more to try and get through. But we've certainly peeked into some really interesting corners of our topic today. But unfortunately, I have to be the bad guy and draw our discussion this afternoon to a close. I would just like to say a huge thank you to both Chantal and Helen for participating in this conversation today. We've heard some really interesting personal experience of strategy, and also some really great tips, I think, that can be usefully employed no matter where an organisation is in its fundraising strategy development. Just to note, of course, that the next Acates Live will be Thursday, the 11th of July. There'll be more details to follow on that soon, of course, so do keep an eye on your inbox. And finally, we are thrilled to announce the launch of Acates Community, a groundbreaking and affordable digital platform for all cultural sector income generation professionals. Going live in October 2024, Acates Community will have 3 pillars: support and learning, a leadership programme, the Purposeful Leader, and community spaces where the sector can come together. Launching with 50 webinars covering every aspect of income generation, from audience identification and consultation to project design and impact frameworks, through to fundraising and new commercial income generation, Acates Community provides everything you need to grow contributed and new income sources. You can dip into webinars and associated resources at any time, or follow the weekly programme with live homework sessions as you prefer. The platform will empower participants with the knowledge, skills and resources to excel and make a meaningful impact in their organisations and the broader cultural sector through our purpose-led and audience-informed approach. Acates Community is more than just a platform. It's a movement towards a resilient, equitable and innovative cultural sector. You can sign up to our waitlist now to join Acates' revolutionary new offer, or simply reach out to one of our team to learn more. It just remains for me to say once again, thank you so much to Chantal and to Helen, and we look forward to seeing you all back with us again next month. Bye for now.